Hello and welcome to lecture 4 of the endocrine system. Today we're going to be talking about the adrenal gland, aka the suprarenal gland, breaking down into its components of the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. So objectives, we're going to go over the anatomy and the histology of the adrenal gland, the major hormones, the synthesis as well as the mode of action of those hormones, the physiological effects of the hormones, the regulation of the synthesis and the secretion, as well as kind of its role in health and wellness, aka kind of the pathologies associated with when these hormones are not acting as they are supposed to. So the adrenal glands are retroperitoneal organs. Just means that they are outside of that that peritoneum, that membrane, kind of that sheet of smooth tissue that lines the abdominal pelvic cavity and surrounds all of those abdominal organs. So, and as we can also see, very similar to the thyroid, we have lots of different blood vessels going into the adrenal gland. Again, because we have lots of hormones and lots of control that we need from the adrenal gland. So looking at the overall structure, there's kind of, you could compare it to say that there are two different glands all wrapped up into one pretty package. We have the cortex and then the medulla. The cortex is more similar to the epithelial glands, kind of like the anterior pituitary is. And the medulla is more kind of nervous system type related, nervous system type gland. Kind of comparing that to the posterior pituitary. We'll get deeper into like the full division of each of these, but we're going to start with the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal medulla is the inner part of that adrenal gland, the suprarenal gland. It is where we produce catecholamine hormones. Now, our catecholamines are our epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, those kind of ones, those kind of hormones. The two that we focus on, though, are epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are produced in the medulla. Now, if we remember, epinephrine and norepinephrine, these are both neurotransmitters. Hit caps locks. Neurotransmitters as well as hormones. So looking at it here, we're going to be talking about the hormone function of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Inside of the adrenal medulla, we have these cells called chromaffin cells. So big kind of words, kind of defining them. So these cells are known as modified postganglionic sympathetic neurons. So what does that mean? If we think about the nervous system, remember the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, we have those different, those pre-ganglionic neurons and the post-ganglionic neurons. These chromaffin cells are more neuron type related cells. They call them modified because they're not exactly neuron cells like post-ganglionic neuron cells typically would be. So they're modified post-ganglionic sympathetic neurons that are responsible for making and storing the catecholamines, that epinephrine and norepinephrine, until they're ready to be released. Contained within, amongst all of those cells, we have these sinusoids. It's where like the vessels and stuff are coming through, and that's where those hormones are going to be released into the blood to be taken out to the body. So things we want to remember chromaffin cells, kind of what they are and what they do, and then they deposit their hormones into these sinusoids. Looking at the production of catecholamines, this is kind of looking back previously at our biochemistry knowledge. When we look at like the amino acid derivatives from biochemistry, here is where we're seeing all of this. Again, our phenylalanine, our tyrosine, and this whole chain, this cascade, going from phenylalanine to tyrosine to dopa to dopamine. This should typically is L-dopa, dopamine, norepinephrine, and then finally epinephrine. This pathway right here is super, super important. It is always popping up on board exams, so we want to remember this pathway. And again, if we've seen this pathway, specifically we saw it in biochemistry, we touched on it in biochemistry 1, we touched on it in biochemistry 2. I believe it was also briefly mentioned, very briefly mentioned in physiology 1. So here we are again in physiology 2. So if we're having multiple courses, and as well this is not going to go away, we'll see this kind of this general pathway a couple more times, not as in depth as we do in these courses. But this is going to come back around and around and around all the time. So really make sure you lock this in, that phenylalanine goes to tyrosine, goes to L-dopa, to dopamine, to norepinephrine, then epinephrine. This is that pathway that we want to remember. So the adrenal medulla, this is going to be the primary location where epinephrine is going to be produced in the body. This is kind of a little side note. We usually say that the adrenal medulla is the only place where epinephrine is truly produced, but there are a couple other small spots, like the medulla oblongata, where it is created as well. But primarily for examination's sake and for kind of more of this not super deep dive level material that we're going over, we tend to say that the adrenal medulla is the primary location, or the only location where epinephrine is produced in the body. And that is due to the fact that we have this enzyme, this phenylethylamine N-methyltransferase, because that is not found in any other location. Right there, we know norepinephrine, converting norepinephrine to epinephrine requires that specific enzyme, and it's found only in the adrenal medulla. So we think back a little bit, neural control. Remember when we talked about the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, all that kind of stuff? Directly from the hypothalamus, we have neurons that go out and they go all the way down to, and they connect to the adrenal gland. This is also why this is compared to the posterior pituitary, because just like the posterior pituitary has nerves directly from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary for the oxytocin and the ADH release, the hypothalamus is directly connected with sympathetic neurons to the adrenal medulla. And so those signals from sympathetic nerves act on the chromaffin cells, causing them to release the epinephrine, norepinephrine. And if you remember epinephrine, norepinephrine, the other name for epinephrine is adrenaline. We think, what happens if we release adrenaline into our system? That is going to be our fight or flight response. That fight or flight response, where our body prepares to either fight for its life or to run away. So this is kind of that short term, that quick release. We see all of these different kind of effects. Hopefully we've seen a couple times before up to this point, but we get that glycogenolysis, or the breakdown of glycogen. We increase our respiration rate. Our heart rate goes up to pump more blood to get oxygen to the muscles faster. Our pupils dilate to make sure that we can see, so we're bringing in more light. We get an increased basal metabolic rate because of everything's moving. Our tissues start to produce ATP a lot more because they're preparing to fight or to flee. As also we get that change in the blood flow, constriction in the non-essential areas, so places like the intestines, the stomach, those kind of things. We take blood away from that, because we're going to need it more in the muscles to get us to run away. So that is the job of the adrenal medulla, that short-term stress response. We're going to I tried to pair these up together just because it makes more sense to fully talk about the adrenal medulla and then go from the adrenal medulla into the cortex. So we're going to talk about all the stuff with the adrenal medulla, so as well as the pathology. There's really only one pathology that we focus on, at least in these courses, with the adrenal medulla, and that is known as a pheochromocytoma. As you can see, there's lots of information that I put on this screen. A lot of it is just kind of extra information that you will see again in the future. The main thing to remember is that a pheochromocytoma is a cancer of the chromaffin cells. So essentially the cell grows out of control, replicates out of control, and all of those chromaffin cells produce catecholamines. So we have a whole bunch of excess catecholamines being released into the body, and you can kind of stop and you can think, okay, what's going to happen with that? It's as if, if we're in constant fight or flight mode. So it's like this: we have a cancer, it's growing too much, a bunch more extra adrenaline is being released from their gland. The general things to remember: the 5 H's. This we want to remember. The 5 H's: hypertension, headache, hyperhidrosis, hypermetabolism, and hyperglycemia. So with all of these, because if you think about hyperglycemia, the body is going to be releasing a bunch of glucose into the blood, prepping the body to be using a bunch of excess glucose in order to fight or to flee. And all of these kind of make sense. When we're in fight or flight, anxiety type mode, our blood pressure goes up. If we have sustained high blood pressure, we're going to get headaches. Hyperhidrosis, because our basal metabolic rate is higher, temperature's higher, so we're going to be sweating, get that hypermetabolism, that high BMR, and then hyperglycemia as a result. We just talked about that. The most common symptoms in the pheochromocytoma, the P, H, and E, we get heart palpitations, we could get headache, and we get that episodic sweating, that hyperhidrosis. It's also known as diaphoresis. So this is what we want to remember about pheochromocytoma. Again, that is a tumor of the adrenal medulla. Now, the adrenal cortex, or the outside portion of the adrenal gland, is divided into 3 different zones. We have the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. If you want to come up with some kind of acronym, GFR, it's a good way to think about it. GFR, just remembering the order from outer to inner. Each of these different zones are going to be producing their own specific hormones, and all of the hormones that are produced here in the adrenal gland, in the adrenal cortex, are going to be steroids or related directly to steroid production. Looking at the histology, we'll get into each of these zones individually as we go through. So we have the outermost. We do have a connective tissue capsule, so a capsule surrounds the adrenal gland. If you've done your dissecting courses, you'll see this as you dissect out this gland. You have the zona glomerulosa here on top, the zona fasciculata, and then the zona reticularis, and then from the zona reticularis inwards is then the medulla. This little cut right there. Zona glomerulosa, it makes what are called mineral corticoids. Mineral corticoids regulates salt and water balance, and the hormone is known as aldosterone. So aldosterone is a mineral corticoid. The mineral corticoid that the adrenal gland produces is aldosterone. There's different ways you can ask that kind of question. The middle layer produces glucocorticoids, and that is going to be our cortisol, and this is going to manage our sugar, fat, and as well as inflammation. Cortisol is also known as a stress hormone. We'll kind of get into all of that. Zona reticularis is the innermost layer, and that is responsible for the production of androgenic steroids, also known as adrenogenic steroids, and these are the precursors of our sex hormones. Really what is produced is androgen, also another way of saying that is DHEA, dihydroepiandrosterone. This is the hormone, I should say, more the hormone precursor to produce a bunch of the other sex hormones, like progesterone, estrogen, as well as testosterone. A little bit, it can also be converted in the creation of cortisol, but mainly, we look at progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone being those sex hormones. Just another little picture. Remember, so we have salt, sugar, and it says muscles. I guess testosterone is the muscle one. So salt, sugar, muscle. Little biochemistry review. Remember that steroids are coming from our fats. They're coming from cholesterol. So see, we are ACTH hormone, the adrenal corticotropic hormone, is coming from that pituitary gland, coming down here, binding to the receptor, uptaking low-density lipoproteins, breaking them down, getting out cholesterol, and then the cholesterol is going to be used to produce all of that stuff. It's either go to progesterone, estrogen, or testosterone. We can see it all again here, going all the way through from cholesterol, produce aldosterone, cholesterol to produce cortisol, and cholesterol to produce androstenedione, which is the post of DHEA. Most commonly, they ask about DHEA. That's the one that they like to ask about. As well as we have our desmolase is the enzyme, which is our rate-limiting step in each of these zones. And so everything is coming from cholesterol, which is why I say that they're all essentially steroid or steroid-related hormones. I should add in here as well. Come from cholesterol. So all of these are coming from cholesterol. These couple of slides are just going to touch on these. We'll get more into the specifics as we go and dive into each individual hormone. Transport and metabolism, transporting cortisol and aldosterone. Cortisol has a corticosteroid binding globulin known as transcortin, which binds most of the cortisol. Otherwise, it binds to albumin. Aldosterone binds to plasma proteins and then is free in the plasma. And metabolism, the liver is responsible again for binding and breaking these down, and either putting them into the bile, or they can be excreted into the urine as well once they've been conjugated. So this is just a little bit of a overview slide. We'll get into a little bit more of the specifics when we could talk about each hormone individually. Mode of action, all of these as well. These are going to be nuclear receptors because they are steroids. They're known as gene active hormones that go into the nucleus in order to bind directly onto receptors which impact the DNA to cause production of different proteins and mRNA transcription, all that kind of stuff, to change the function or the activity of the cell. I should add into here nuclear receptors. Okay, breaking down each one individually, what they do, as well as the pathology of them. So our mineralocorticoids, aka aldosterone, produced by the zona glomerulosa. The physiological effects of aldosterone is going to be happening primarily in the kidneys as well as in the blood vessels themselves. So in the kidneys, it goes to the renal tubular cells to cause reabsorption of sodium and secretion of potassium. So it kind of exchanges the sodium for the sodium for the potassium in order to maintain our blood serum sodium levels. So the resorption of the sodium causes reabsorption of water because the water is going to follow that sodium to increase blood volume as well as increasing blood pressure. Yeah, it's a little extra tidbit, not super important. Aldosterone also causes sodium and potassium transport in sweat glands, salivary glands, and intestinal epithelial cells. The way that aldosterone works, so aldosterone binds to mineralocorticoid receptors located in the distal convoluted tubule, as well as the cortical collecting duct of the kidney. A lot of this kidney stuff, we're going to have a whole lecture on the kidney itself. So a lot of this anatomy and this stuff with the kidney, we're going to review all of that eventually when we get there. But just roughly, all in through here, that cortical collecting duct after the glomerulosis, the loop of Henle into all this, towards the end stage in the cortical collecting duct, is when we're going to be having aldosterone be act on everything. We'll dive a lot deeper into kidney stuff in a future lecture. Aldosterone working to maintain blood pressure through the balance of sodium and potassium ions in the blood. A little bit more on the mode of action. Again, it's a nuclear receptor in the cortical collecting duct, triggers gene expression, increases the number of sodium channels in the lumen, increases mitochondrial ATP production, as well as an increased ATPase enzyme expression for the sodium-potassium transport system. The way that aldosterone is controlled is through a whole system. There's two different ways that aldosterone is controlled, or I should say two different systems through which aldosterone release is controlled. Primary way is through something called the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, RAAS. Secondarily, there's also the ACTH pathway. So this is the hypothalamus anterior pituitary gland pathway. The primary one is the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. You should have covered a little bit of the renin-angiotensin system, or the way that works in Physiology 1, but we'll review it again here. We're going to start with the ACTH pathway, the adrenocorticotropic hormone pathway. So the starts in the hypothalamus. Remember, in the hypothalamus, we have those osmolarity receptors. We're constantly checking the blood, checking to see what's in the blood, what the concentrations are, whether we need more or less of any of the different components of it. And if the body decides, hey, we do need to either increase volume, or let's say we don't have enough sodium, or we don't have enough volume, whatever it is, concentrations are off, we release a corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, goes to the anterior pituitary gland, which then releases the adrenocorticotropic hormone into the bloodstream. At the adrenal cortex, it acts on the adrenal cortex, in this case specifically the zona glomerulosa, stimulating the production and release of aldosterone. Yeah, and again, ACTH is secondary to the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. The ACTH pathway, is more during acute stress or when aldosterone is needed to be rapidly increased. So think some kind of big event, either we have a whole bunch of blood loss, or we have like severe vomiting, diarrhea, that kind of stuff. We're losing a lot of fluid and a lot of sodium, and our body needs to compensate very quickly in order to keep us alive. So that's more the ACTH pathway. The renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, when the blood pressure drops or sodium levels are low, we have these cells in the kidneys called juxtaglomerular cells. They're also called JG cells. And they are going to detect the low blood pressure or the low sodium levels, and that causes them to release an enzyme, renin. When renin is released, it converts angiotensinogen, which is produced by the liver. It converts it into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 gets converted then to angiotensin 2 by the ACE enzyme, which we'll want to remember that name of that enzyme, in the lungs. So right now we have the kidneys, the liver, and the lungs all working together as part of this system. That angiotensin 2 is going to go and it binds to vessels. It causes vasoconstriction, as well as it goes to the adrenal cortex and stimulates the release of aldosterone. So once that aldosterone is released, it comes all the way back to the kidneys, acts on that collecting tubule, the cortical collecting duct, and then we get increased activity of the channels as well as increased presentation of those channels in order to uptake sodium and uptake water in order to restore the proper blood pressure and sodium levels. This pathway, there's lots of really good, this pathway is still a little confusing too, you want to spend a little bit more time with this. There are lots of good videos on kind of which walk you through this process on YouTube and other places. Just go ahead and if you look up the renin-angiotensin, even if you just look up RAAS pathway, and they'll walk you through step by step exactly how this pathway happens. So, but this is about as deep as we need to go with this, just understanding the different components involved. It starts in the kidneys, goes through with the angiotensin produced by the liver, then it goes to the lungs, and then finally all the way goes to the lungs as well as then goes to the vessels and to the adrenal gland, and then finally comes full circle back acting again on the kidneys. Here's just in kind of a picture form, both of those systems, really simple, really broken down. Okay, we're going to go over the pathologies of aldosterone, and then we'll end this video and do a second part. So, when we have excessive production, typically with any of these hormones, there's two issues. Either there's too much of it or there's not enough of it. And so that's what we're going to see a lot, is when is there too much, when is there too little, what's that called, what happens. When we have too much hyperaldosteronism, it's something called Conn's syndrome. Most commonly, this is due to hyperplasia or a tumor of the zona glomerulosa. We call this kind of tumor we call a functional adenoma. It's essentially just a tumor where the cells are still, they're not unhealthy enough to the point where they stop doing their job. They still are producing and releasing the hormone like they're supposed to, but now there's a whole bunch more of the cells, and so we get too much release of the aldosterone. As a result, we get hypokalemia, which means that we have not enough. Hypo is less, kalemia is potassium. Sorry, the cal is potassium, emia being in the blood. So not enough potassium in the blood. This results in muscle weakness as well as cardiac arrhythmias because we need the potassium, within the muscles to do its job, to send those action potentials, to do all that kind of stuff. We also get excessive reabsorption of sodium and water along with it. We get high blood pressure, and as a result, with having so much more water up through, we have that impaired renal concentration and polyuria. So the renal tissue, the kidneys, are having a hard time managing the correct concentrations, and you also get excessive urination because of all of the excess water that we're storing. We also get hypertension. This kind of walks through that whole process. Why? Too much sodium, we get increased extracellular fluid volume, which leads to then increased intracellular pressure, and then increased excessive urine production, and then lots of sodium coming through because the kidneys eventually get damaged. And then again, that low blood potassium. Kind of a little bit repeat here. Only additional thing we also get alkalosis because of increased hydrogen secretion into the tubules. Now, aldosterone deficiency, we're just going to touch on Addison's here. We'll talk about it more later because Addison's is a little bit more of multiple groups. It's not just the zona glomerulosa. It also involves the zona fasciculata. So I put that kind of towards the end of this lecture. But yeah, aldosterone deficiency, most often we see it as part of Addison's disease, and which is also known as adrenal insufficiency. It's basically just a hyposecretion of a good percentage, a good chunk of the adrenal cortex. It's caused by damage to adrenal glands. So typically you get not enough cortisol and also not enough aldosterone being secreted. And again, it can be either due to external damage or autoimmune conditions. We'll look more at Addison's disease towards the end of this lecture. The loss of those mineralocorticoids, again, kind of the opposite. We get excess potassium and hyperkalemia. We get decrease of sodium and hyponatremia, the decreased extracellular fluid and blood volume, and the cardiac output decreases, and then you can get shock from that. So if we're not getting enough blood to the entire system, then our body can go into shock trying to protect ourselves. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end this recording here, right at 30 minutes, and then we will continue with the next zone, the zona fasciculata, and cortisol.